Okay, hello everyone in microbiome space. I have the amazing and wonderful Lacey Hall joining us this morning. Lacey is a registered dietitian with a master's in clinical nutrition. Her career extends from working in the medical intensive care to running health programs in rainforests to Bali, Indonesia. She is passionate about finding the bridge between modern medicine and ancient modalities. By utilizing evidence-based functional medicine, she helps patients regain control of their health. Currently, Lacey is the Clinical Education Manager for Microbiome Labs and is one of the consultants available to review BiomeFX reports for providers. And we're so excited to have you today, Lacey. Take it away.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. I'm not used to getting the bio. I'm usually the one delivering them, so it's a change of pace for me. But thank you for having me and hosting me. This is a really fun area to talk about. For those of you that are new to our stool test, I really want to just hone in and focus on some of the interesting things that we're finding in these case reports. So I'm sure many of you use and have utilized stool testing in your practice. I hope you've had a chance to look over BiomeFX because it is a bit of a departure from what we traditionally see in stool testing. I've worked for various laboratories, there you go, prior to working with Microbiome Labs. So, it was a paradigm shift for me to go from looking at, maybe 100 different species of bacteria rather than with BiomeFX, we're taking a step back and getting this 30,000-foot view of the microbiome and really trying to hone in on the interaction between these microbes living in our gut and how they impact our health, wellness, and disease risk factors. So, we've co-evolved with microbes for millions of years. We have this symbiotic relationship. So now that science is now emerging and developing, we're able to see this link of how microbes truly impact our biochemistry, our disease risk, and how altering them can make major metabolic impacts in your patients. So if you need a little bit of a tutorial on the test itself, you reach out to Tracy. I really just want to dive into some results that can maybe, a light bulb may go off because you may have some patients in your practice that are similar to the cases here. And I have to say, these are the initial reports since I've just been doing these now for about 90 days. So I'm excited to get the follow-up, and maybe in 6 or 9 months when I have the follow-up report, we could see how much of an impact we have made. So these are some initial cases and reviews that I've done, all right? So our first patient is a 35-year-old woman suffering from Hashimoto's disease, which has actually improved quite a bit. Her antibodies were in the thousands, now they're down to the 300s. She has a lot of food and environmental sensitivities and triggers. She's currently following a strict gluten-free and dairy-free diet. She's been on many antibiotics for other inflammation going on in her gut, which has been confirmed via scope. She's on a couple of supplements like Histow from Zymogen, I think a different histamine blocker as well from Seeking Health. And she has done an elimination diet, but recently received her results back from an MRT food sensitivity test. So she's working with her provider to implement those specific changes because the elimination diet didn't do much for her. Okay. One of the first things that we look at in our report, again, it's a higher level view, but it can give us a lot of information and link back to what the patients are already going through. First, we want to look at something like alpha diversity, just the number of species living in her gut. With her history of antibiotic use, we can see here that her alpha diversity is doing pretty poorly. She's at a 3.97, and our goal, our optimal level, really is to get it above 8. I do see plenty of people at a 10, and those are people that are really making strong efforts in their lifestyle and in their environment to protect their microbiome. So she's definitely suffering here. When we look at these plots, these are called whisker plots. And this grayed out box will represent 97% of the samples. Think of this as sort of a bell curve. These are the outliers, right up here, and down here. And remember, when we're working with Cosmos ID, our laboratory, they've been highly validated in the medical space. You've probably never heard of them because they've been behind the scenes in research. But the cohort that we're looking at to establish our healthy population was the cohort used in the American Gut Project, the Human Microbiome Project. So we have a very robust sample size that's been well studied for the last 15 years. So we're comparing our specimen here against this cohort. So she's doing a bit poorly. We really do want to see this alpha diversity creep up. When we look at beta diversity, our goal here is to have this red dot in the thickest part of the cluster plot. So any deviation away from here is showing that the quality of the bacteria, not the quantity, now we're looking at quality, this quality is deviating from the norm. So this is showing early signs of dysbiosis without getting too specific. Again, we're being more generalized here, but it's showing us that there are some compositional dissimilarities between her gut microbiome and a healthy population. So we look at some pathogens, and she's got just a couple here. She's got a bit of an overgrowth of C. diff. Our reference range and our healthy relative abundance, our goal is to get her between 0.05 or 0.36 or 0. That would be, I guess, most ideal. She's clocking in at about 1.78, which isn't horrible. She's not experiencing anything too symptomatic. And she also has a little bit of Campylobacter within the range. So, you know, traditionally, maybe 5 years ago, I would have wanted to go after this with some sort of antimicrobial or done a specific protocol. But now we really want to look at all angles of her microbiome and really support an overall environmental shift that allows her body to protect herself against an overgrowth of C. diff. So when pathogens are present, they want to change the environment to make sure themselves and their friends can grow out of control. So oftentimes they'll secrete stuff like ammonia that's going to increase the pH of the intestinal lumen. They want to make a more alkaline environment so they can survive. So by using certain products and making dietary shifts, we can help bring the acidity back down so that keystone strains are able to thrive better and pathogens aren't able to overgrow. So to me, I don't need to go at this aggressively, but we do need to take care of it because we don't want something like this to start laying the foundation and growing out of hand, because she does have other dysbiosis that's been noted in her test. So again, when we look at a higher level, when we look at things like a more general firmicutes to Bacteroides ratio, really we like to look at this as a range, not necessarily a ratio. An ideal world would be 0.25, but even going up to 1, 1.5, 2 would be fine. She's at 30.88. It's telling me that she has so much firmicutes, species and families living in her gut, that she's not getting any sort of diversity. This is going back to her alpha diversity, showing that there really aren't a lot of representation of species living in her gut. So we see here that she's very skewed to the other direction. When we look at the phylum level for a US healthy population, we're just looking at the biggest groups of bacteria. And this would be our ideal patient right here. So ideally, in a healthy individual, we would have about 70% of her phylum would be represented by Bacteroides, 25% represented by firmicutes, and a little bit of proteobacteria and your other bacteria living there. Look at her results. She is 94% firmicutes, just a little bit of Bacteroides and some actinobacteria. So she's so skewed in this direction, and that may be because she was on antibiotics and it just allowed for these other groups of bacteria to be overrepresented. The competition between species has been eliminated because of all the conditions that she's going through and the use of antibiotics too. So we need to get in there and diversify this microbiome. She needs it badly. And there are links between an overgrowth of firmicutes and worsening autoimmune conditions. So for this specific provider, I did have to go into PubMed and start to play around a little bit, because there are patterns that we see in these reports. And I'll tell you, it's never ending. I find myself on PubMed going down these rabbit holes constantly because you know, what we know about the microbiome today is so much different than what I learned in the hospital 10 years ago. I mean, I wish I could go back and slap myself and say, oh my gosh, like, what were you doing? But medicine has just evolved so much in what we know. 10 years from now, I may look back and say, oh my gosh, you know, what was I saying? But it's important for us to try to stay on top of what is emerging in medical literature. And it is exciting as new research comes out all the time. So when we think about autoimmune conditions, you know, that's a whole other subject in itself. But we do know that this, the effects of things like molecular mimicry from a poor digestive system, low stomach acidity, leaky gut is going to link to this immune response against peptides often found in food. So it's commonly recommended for individuals with Hashimoto's disease to stop eating wheat and gluten products because the protein found in those products looks extremely similar to your thyroid protein. To your thyroid tissue. So in the presence of leaky gut, which she certainly has, it's worsening her symptoms. So we really need to improve this because her immune system tolerance has just been lost. Her body is obviously attacking itself and attacking a lot of the foods around her. So she's got this overactive immune system that we certainly want to calm down. There's a part in our report called the metabolically and biologically important bacteria. And we look at different ways in which microbes influence different metabolic processes in our body. It's an area we want to keep expanding on because that's kind of where both worlds converge with the microbiome and human health. For her, her estrobolome level was really low. Now, this level can get a little bit confusing. It's a bit backward from what you may expect, but a low estrobolome is going to indicate that you're not excreting estrogen well. You have a low excretion of estrogen, meaning estrogen is being reabsorbed continuously into your body, which naturally happens, but it's too much. So for her, she already has a thyroid condition having to do with hormone imbalances. Now I would suggest to her to run a Dutch test or ZRT, whatever you're comfortable with, to look at her sex hormones. What is the breakdown of estrogens in her body? And is she showing a sign of estrogen dominance within her body as well? Because if she is, a lot of that is rooted in her microbiome. So I find that most people aren't familiar with the estrobolome. So I think this is a really easy chart to give you an overview of what that estrobolome is. When your body is getting ready to excrete and metabolize estrogen, it's destined for the liver. It goes through the phase 1 and 2 detoxification pathways. It's conjugated, and then some of it heads to the urine to be excreted, just a small amount, I think about 10% or 20%. And then the rest goes through the hepatobiliary circulation, through the intestinal tract, and about 65% is going to go out through your stool. Now, if you have an overgrowth of this network of estrobolome bacteria, which is about 65 different species of bacteria, give or take, as far as we know now, then you're going to reabsorb high levels of estrogen. So think about patients that present with PCOS, painful periods, hormone imbalances, cystic acne. Some of this is really resonating and originating in your gut. So we want to, again, get in there and diversify, because a lot of the problem exists because there's such an overgrowth of her Clostridia species and certain species within the Firmicutes phylum. And we can tailor make that a little bit more. I'm not showing all of her results, but we do have the ability to look at different families of bacteria that are overgrown that have to do with the estrobolome. And it's a common conversation that I do have with practitioners. Okay, so when we dig further, the protected aspects of her microbiome include keystone species. We really want to enhance and really beef up these species because they are linked to the most well-researched health benefits. So each species has a different, they're known for different things, but many of them are anti-inflammatory, associated with better metabolism, and associated with better diversity. Lots of these keystone species help eat the foods coming down your gastrointestinal tract, especially fibers and resistant starches, and they create more metabolites that feed other beneficial strains. So clearly, she's having a hard time. This is one of the worst I think I've seen. Many of these are not detected. This was the best, I believe. Her Roseburia intestinalis was okay. But to have none of these detected is quite unique, because it's really showing that even though, you know, her alpha diversity is low, she has a really strong shift in the overall phylum in her body. And then she doesn't have the protective factors. Now, Firmicutes is not like some bad phylum. Actually, a lot of these keystone species live in there, but she's not even showing that those Firmicute species are being represented. Again, so it comes back to diversification and healing that leaky gut. So for her other keystone species, not even detectable. Okay, so she's got a lot to work on. So findings, how do we define dysbiosis? Loss of beneficial organisms like keystone species, an excessive growth of potentially harmful organisms, and many Firmicute species are opportunistic and can become pathogenic, and a loss of overall microbial diversity. Well, for her, check, check, check. She certainly has this overall look of dysbiosis. Now, for us at Microbiome Labs and for myself personally, you know, going through line by line and looking at one species at a time isn't really our aim for a test like this. We want to make larger shifts in the overall personality and ecology of her gut. Even 1% shifts can make great metabolic impact. So the excessive Firmicutes coupled with low beneficial microbes can be aggravating her autoimmune symptoms, certainly aggravating her sensitivities and leaky gut. She's prone to estrogen dominance, so I would recommend that they run a full sex hormone panel. And then for her, a lot of this is going to have to be finding the diet that works for her right now. Hopefully, you know, the goal in the future is to create such a strong intestinal barrier, you know, healing her tight junctions in her gut, rebuilding the mucin 2 barrier so that she can eat more foods. She shouldn't be reacting to healthy foods. You know, and I really think that we can regain that tolerance so that her immune system isn't constantly being activated. I want to support her liver and bile function. We can use something like artichoke leaf extract to help that, since there's a lot of pressure on her liver right now to detoxify or to conjugate this estrogen, to work with other detoxification pathways as well that are probably being taxed. I want to lower inflammation with omega-3s, maybe turmeric. You know, there's many things that you can use within your apothecary, whatever you're familiar and comfortable with. And then I would use many of our products. I'm going to recondition the gut, and I would go about this a little more aggressively, depending on patient compliance, financial burden. I always try to meet in the middle. I personally hate taking pills, so I'm very sympathetic to patients that have to take a lot. And, you know, we're one slice of your protocol. So, you know, whatever the patient's willing to do. I mix a lot of our products into food for myself, for my son, so I don't have to swallow another capsule. Kind of a wimp with it. But I would recommend Megaspore and A258 for the diversification factor, also to support liver health. We just published a new study on hepatotoxicity showing that Megaspore helps to increase glutathione production in the liver and total antioxidant capacity, and it can protect the liver better or just as well as milk thistle. So I got to dump milk thistle from my cabinet. I'd recommend IgG 2000, because as we kill off bacteria and we change the gut, when they release their toxins, that's going to cause more of an immune system burden for this individual. We want to calm that immune system down. All of those toxins are going to leak straight into the bloodstream and cause more problems for her. So IgG is similar to a lock and key mechanism where it's like a magnet. It's going to bind C. diff toxins, bind all sorts of different toxins, bacteria, molds, parasites, flagellin, that are able, so that your body isn't taxed with having to deal with it in the presence of leaky gut. And then again, I would use Mega Prebiotic for more diversification. Again, diversification is the name of the game here. We really need to help rebuild that entire ecology, because it's being overly dominated by a few species and it's not being represented by her beneficial strains. So there's research on all of the recommendations here, which is how I tend to function as best I can. You know, sometimes it doesn't exist in functional medicine, but I do my best to pull things that are research based. Okay, so that's our first case. How am I doing on time? Okay. I can be long-winded, so bear with me. Okay. I often return to this picture in patient education and client education. I recommend printing it out and laminating it for patients. It's good for them to connect with what's happening in their body, understanding that you have this thin mucus barrier well above your enterocytes, where most of your microbes live, your microbiome, where all your food's passing through. You want this thick mucosal barrier that's a nice buffer, because bacteria and inflammatory compounds and things that are found in our diet and lifestyle should never come in contact with our enterocytes. Mucosal breakdown is so common and seen in any inflammatory condition, especially autoimmunity. So rebuilding this barrier is really critical for our first case and for our second case. So when this barrier is broken and all of these toxins and pathogens and lipopolysaccharide is seeping through, it's constantly triggering an immune response, a cytokine storm, and the inflammatory processes. So the better that we can control this, again, by healing and sealing the gut, hopefully the more free her life is. She can eat more foods, enjoy more things. We really work to clean up her lifestyle too. I always give a lifestyle checklist. We all have areas to improve upon. Some people are awesome. They're growing their own food, making their own cleaners, but not all of us are there. Okay. Our second case is more complex than our first. It's an 11-year-old female presenting with neurological problems, behavioral issues, sensory issues, sensitivity to light. Sort of think of an autistic child, even though this is not autism, and just an overburden on her neurological system in general. She suffers from constipation. It's an 11-year-old child, so remember, this is a limited diet. We can't create these ideal food plans. It would be a constant battle. I can only imagine. My son's used to me pushing supplements and foods and, lecturing him. But, when you're dealing with some neurological problems and a lot of anxiety around food and health as well, that's going to create some problems. Not taking any supplements right now. Okay, so neurological problems. Now, going into a gut-brain connection is a totally different webinar, and we have a really good one, so I encourage you to ask Tracy for that link to get a nice overview of the gut-brain connection. But I just want to highlight here that it is a two-way street. Your gut and your brain are formed at the same time in utero. Some of that's going to be your central nervous system. Some of that's going to be your enteric nervous system. But they very much interact and if you have a leaky gut, you have a leaky brain. And so looking at this report was very fascinating. Oh, sorry, I forgot I put this one in there too. So your gut is responsible for a lot of things like neurotransmitter production, GABA production, serotonin, and that interaction and that, again, two-way communication is very important in many neurological conditions, especially in functional neurology, which is another rabbit hole you can go down for months or years and continuously learning. But lowering the cytokine productions and helping to heal the gut can play a major role in helping many neurological conditions. Okay, so this little girl presented with a lot of dysbiosis. So I didn't show you this on the last one, but the overall gut score, microbiome score for her, is about 15 out of 40, so pretty low. Generally speaking, people presenting, a normal person may present around 25, and maybe they're suffering from some SIBO or dysbiosis. A healthy individual, I really want to see above 35. That's a general and very achievable goal. So 14 is quite low. Look at her alpha diversity, none. She doesn't even have a history of using antibiotics, which is, mind-boggling to me. She has no strength in her diversity. So being at 0.9, a 0 practically on a scale of 1 to 10. So she is showing and presenting with a lot of issues to start with. Beta diversity, again, she's young, but she's pulling away from the bacteria that she has there. The composition and the quality of the bacteria there are not very good. She had some pathogens present, E. coli, Klebsiella, and some candida. We can use a lot of different products that help clean up, again, the E. coli and the Klebsiella. Again, they're trying to make the environment of the intestinal lumen more alkaline. That enables them to live easier. That's going to put more pressure on her liver, and that's going to increase her toxic burden as well. So adding more fuel to the fire as we battle and try to help and impact these neurological conditions. Candida almost has to take a back seat. We'll deal with it later because she's, again, an 11-year-old girl. How much are we going to be able to do? Hopefully some of that self-corrects as we recondition the gut. But I wasn't able to put her on any dietary changes, sure, but I really couldn't put her on Candida supplements at this time. It was too much. Okay, so when we look at some of these ratios again, now we did change some of the formatting, but when we look at the ratios here, her firmicutes to Bacteroides, again, very high out of this range, out of 22. So she has very much of an overgrowth of firmicutes. But this one was most shocking to me. So this chart does not do its justice. Proteobacteria to actinobacteria. Proteobacteria are your most pathogenic and most inflammatory species. They contain the most lipopolysaccharide in their cell wall. So when they burst open and when they die, which happens with every eating event, that lipopolysaccharide is seeping into your bloodstream and triggering an inflammatory and immune response. So look at how much she has in this ratio. It's 1,704.53 out of this healthy ratio, meaning she doesn't have any actinobacteria, none, basically at 0. And she has such an overgrowth of these inflammatory species. So inflammation, inflammation, inflammation. And it's happening in her gut and it's happening in her brain. When we look at her donut charts for what a healthy microbiome should look like, again, this is the same what we saw in the last person. An ideal world would have 70% Bacteroides, 25% Firmicutes, a little bit of Proteobacteria, 2%. That should be our goal, our maximum goal for these bad guys that live there. She's at 86% Proteobacteria, 12% or 13% Firmicutes, and nothing else. And this is easily seen by her alpha diversity because it's not there. So all of her pathogenic bacteria have just had a field day. I mean, there is so much work to be done for this little girl. And if you're not familiar with lipopolysaccharide and its links to metabolic endotoxemia, more severely in the hospital, we see this as sepsis. But low-grade chronic metabolic endotoxemia happens every single day with leaky gut. So fixing that overall ecology and then helping to heal the gut prevents it from entering your bloodstream. Rebuilding that mucosal barrier can help prevent that inflammatory response. So LPS is linked to many chronic conditions. You know, we can look for some that are linked to neurological conditions and assess, you know, if it's coming back to her. But think about your patients. And autoimmunity and chronic constipation. The constipation makes sense for her because she has such a high level of these LPS-containing bacteria that they're disrupting this migrating motor complex by getting into the enteric nervous system. It's probably causing problems with her interstitial cells of Cajal and her vinculin cells that control that pacemaker to your gastrointestinal tract. So we can look a little bit deeper into the families of bacteria that are living there too. With her results in the back of her report, we can see the overall family breakdown of what's living there. And don't even pay attention to the names. You'll learn them over time. I have a taxonomy chart that I can send to Tracy to circulate. But the important thing to look at here is look at all of the species that are not represented. 5%, 1%, 4, 3, 0, 0, 0%. They're not there to balance out some of these highly inflammatory species like Enterobacteria, Desulfovibrio. We don't want to see these in the 99th and 100th percentile. So again, inflammation, inflammation. Her keystone strains were very similar, not detectable or at very low levels. Her Akkermansia was the healthiest one of the bunch, but overall she doesn't have any protective factors. to balance out these pathogens. They just can't grow. They cannot thrive there. So for her, again, very much more severe. We want our goals and our findings are to help. We want to lower the LPS containing bacteria, because this is linking to a lot of inflammation that's impacting her brain and her neurological health. Are we going to heal it completely? Hard to say, but if we can make a 50, 60, 70% dent, that's going to really help her quality of life for herself and her parents. The constipation is likely from the LPS. I would recommend a good motility agent to help that prokinetic stimulation, so it's not just sitting there. Overall, diversity, again, is really poor. We need to work on that. Get rid of the pathogens, and then we need to help support the commensal species. So we want to go at this pretty aggressively too. I would recommend using all 3 spore biotics at a higher dose. For her, we're doing 4 of each per day mixed into food to hide. It's tasteless. I hide it in everything for my son. I'll even put it in his water. Up to 12 capsules of IgG a day. So 4 at breakfast, 4 at lunch, 4 at dinner. You can, again, mix this into food, but I would recommend mixing it into savory items. It doesn't mix well in like applesauces, but I mean, you can do mashed potatoes, soups, things like that that are more savory, and you won't taste it at all. You can put it in a smoothie too, that's fine. But again, IgG is going to be in your binder and your neutralizer. We don't want to see an increase of inflammation seeping and contributing from the gut. Lower those COX-1 and 2 pathways, help to resolve the inflammation going on in her body with omega-3 fatty acids. Harder to do though, because you can't hide that oil in food. I gotta say, it's stinky. Kids will know. But you can find some that are kid specific. And I would recommend, if she's able to, if she can sit still and go through this, doing some IV nutrients, because likely she's not going to absorb a lot of the supplements anyway. A lot of nutraceuticals and vitamins and minerals. Support some nutrient deficiencies. She probably has some methylation issues, so we can run some genetics. Use the prebiotic, again, for enhanced diversification. It's like a fertilizer. It's going to go in there. We have great data on its increase of short-chain fatty acids and extra diversification of species. Support the liver, and strongly, no glyphosates, organic only diet. Very strict on that, because glyphosates are just going to make the situation much worse. Okay, so I know that was a bit fast, but those are my 2 case studies. And I'd love to open it up for any questions that you may have about either one.
Okay. I'm going to unmute all. And one of the things I noticed I really like is that there's ranges and not just stars or ratings on the amounts of the pathogens in the organisms.
Yes. So, and that is a new, that's for us, one of the things that makes us unique compared to other tests. You can have a healthy percent that your body can handle. So we don't need to go at things so aggressively. I failed to mention on my first case study, she had just gone through a very strong antimicrobial protocol about 6 months ago. And I don't think it did any help for her. I think it made situations worse. She has no protective aspects to her gut. So, our stance is go in there and support the good guys. Let's make some bigger changes to the overall environment and let your body self-correct. Science and research isn't there to know exactly what you or I need. We don't. We can't even pretend that we do. But we can. Your body is a self-healing organism. So give it the tools and it will self-correct to what it needs to be.
So in this, what we're seeing right now, Lacey, is your pathogen control index. It looks like, this is her value, right? It's over 6 in the green.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little, in a sense, misrepresenting, because her overall proteobacteria level is so high. that seeing anything in the green for her doesn't really make sense for me. You want to look at everything as a whole. So her proteobacteria, which again are your most inflammatory phylum of bacteria, is off the chart high, higher than I've ever seen it. And you know, she has some pathogens here, but she's got plenty of other bacteria that are causing inflammation. You know, some people, I've seen E. coli levels at 10, 12% of the relative abundance, and they're symptomatic. And there are cases where, you know, antibiotics could be warranted, or more, a more intense intervention could be warranted. But for her, she's not.
That's what I was concerned.
Yeah, yeah. So I would try our hardest, and that's why the protocol was much more intense, because we don't want to see something like this overgrow and she, you know, develops renal failure and is in the hospital because of it. You know, and I've even considered thinking maybe broad spectrum antibiotics aren't a bad thing for her, because she doesn't have anything protecting her anyway. She even may be a candidate for a fecal transplant. I mean, it's more extreme, I think, because of the dysbiosis that she's showing. So.
Lacey, on the child, did you have any background on it? Was this a C-section or a bottle-fed child?
Good question. Where are my notes? I don't think so. I don't believe so. I have the notes from my consultation there.
Because you just wonder how someone so young can get such a messed up gut.
Yeah, I know. Parents are motivated, you know, something went wrong. And I mean, again, I always recommend doing a lifestyle assessment. I mean, it could be places, you know, things that they're exposed to environmentally too that are impacting this. You know, checking the house for mold exposure, for toxic heavy metals. You know, we go over a lot of that stuff too, just to, again, decrease the toxic burden in the body that can be contributing to the microbiome. Xenobiotics, BPA. I mean, we go over a lot of that stuff. My consults take too long. I like to get a thorough. They're supposed to be 30 minutes. They always take an hour. So.
Lacey, can you speak to why knowing these species identification may be more important, say, than knowing something like zonulin?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I understand how a lot of tests have these metabolites and other gut health markers. You know, I look for validation. Again, I coming from the lab industry, I always ask for validation reports and information on sensitivity and specificity. It's very important. Your patients are investing hundreds of dollars into these tests. The lab should tell you what they're getting. And unfortunately, a lot of labs are quiet about that. I used to work for SpectraCell, God bless them, but they will not tell you their sensitivity and specificity. I worked for Vibrant Clinical Laboratory, who was the opposite. They wanted to give you their validation report, which is one of the reasons I went to work with them. So things like zonulin are very poorly validated. It has about a 4 to 8 hour half-life as when it leaves your body. So it's not a very strong marker. You can do antibodies to zonulin in your bloodstream, and that's going to give you a more stable marker. I mean, certain markers like calprotectin are good, but short-chain fatty acids, a little bit of a question mark there. I'm trying to think of what else. Lipopolysaccharide is better measured in the bloodstream. And antibodies to gluten, not validated in your stool. I know it's a nice marker. We want it to work. It just doesn't. So again, a lot of things have to be done via serum for a good, strong, validated marker. I don't want to work with things that are 50% accurate. It's a flip of the coin. I'd rather just use symptomology at that point. So that's my 2 cents.
So can I jump in there just to clarify? So the stool test that, I mean, I did one probably 7 years ago. Gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the one. It's out of Dallas, and stool test. And my brother has celiac, so I wanted to test myself. and I came out highly reactive to gluten. And, you know, by just changing my diet, I could tell that that was a good decision. But, you know, what you're saying is really the antibodies to gluten in the stool aren't necessarily accurate, but the blood would be the better marker there.
Yes, you can. And every lab is going to be a little bit different with that and the type of antibodies that they measure. Generally speaking, it's hard for your body to break down gluten. There's some peptide links that are challenging for your enzymes to get in and break down, especially at the proline amino acids are difficult. So a lot of people are reactive. I often see those leaky gut reports that are very highly in the red and reactive. But I prefer, yes, to do it in the blood.
Do you like, because I use Cyrex Labs for my patients, and I feel
great. Vibrant is great. They both have paved the way for antibody testing, and both have been, you know, leaders in that space for a long time.
Yeah. Good. And when you referred to both of these patients, kind of automatically, you said they've got leaky gut. You know, it sort of made that. Is that based on just the cascade of issues that you see here, or does the BiomeFX actually have a marker that says, you know, this is what proves this person has leaky gut?
No, we don't do that. I really go at it by, you know, symptomology and the report. If you have a lot of proteobacteria, again, this one's confident in saying the patient has leaky gut. These bacteria create so much LPS, and then looking back even at Candida create these roots called hyphae that burrow into your intestinal lumen and poke through. They crack your gut that way. So, you know, even that overgrowth is, hers wasn't too severe, but still it's there. I mean, I'm very confident in saying that, definitely. But yeah, I mean, you could go, how much is it? A leaky gut panel is about $150 or so.
Right. Yeah. Like I've done that through Cyrex, you know, for my patients and for myself. And you know, I was surprised that, you know, I didn't end up showing that I had leaky gut, because I kind of someone that, has struggled with some gut issues, but I've also done a lot of work with it too. So maybe that's helped.
Yeah, absolutely. I often see, it's very rare that I see someone that doesn't have, like if they do a leaky gut study or a test, that they come back totally clean. That's very rare. So,
Lacey, can you speak to what some of
these are very interesting studies, case studies?
Yeah, some additional analytes that will be added to this that are scientifically studied?
Yes. I don't know if I have anything to show you on my computer. I'd have to dig around, but yes. So I got a sneak peek of version 2. It's quite fascinating. We are going to be really expanding. Do I have any in here? Hold on, let me go back. The area that has to do with things like the estrobolome. Currently, we're looking at things like ammonia production, sulfate reduction, methane production, and estrogen metabolism. But we're really going to be increasing this area to look at neurotransmitters, TMAO, digestive sufficiency or inefficiency, like protein breakdown. It's a lot. It's going to be awesome, because again, at the end of the day, I do care what bacteria are there, but I really want to know, what are they doing? That's more important to me. What are they doing in your body? Again, because we've co-evolved together, and there is this interaction that that has to do with your biochemistry. So understanding different risk factors for health and disease. I mean, that's really where we want to go with this test. I don't have the list in front of me, but it's quite a few markers. I'm trying to think of what else is on there.
When is that going to happen?
And then it's hard to say. I hate to overpromise, because every lab I've worked for, it always gets pushed back. I would, in a realistic world, let's say mid-June. It could be earlier, but let's say mid-June. Okay, that's the goal. So it's around the corner.
And a lot of questions around any samples that have been submitted prior to that will still be tested with those new analytes at no charge. So you're going to get the benefit when that science is available, but know that these are very strong, scientifically shown analytes, or we wouldn't be adding them.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Our reference list, I'm happy to send it along. It's 14 pages long. It's, you can read it until next year. Yeah, and I am. So.
Well, Lacey, so I really haven't had, because I feel like y'all are still working some things out and, you know, potentially adding new tests. When I do have patients do it, or including myself, will I be able to then consult with you or someone else before I sit down with my patient?
Absolutely. We have a small consulting team right now, but we're going to keep adding to it. So it's myself right now, a gentleman named Dr. Sam Moltz. He's an MD out of Chicago here, and Trish Ward, and we're bringing on another person right now too, an naturopath in Portland. So yeah, we all have our own style of doing this, but yeah, it's a lot of fun to connect with providers and put the pieces to the puzzle together. I try to take my time and work with you on your style and use supplements from our line, but other lines too. We only have 12 products. So I quite a bit, and I try to research it. So.
Yeah, I noticed you said the artichoke extract, and it's your MegaGuard that has some artichoke in it, right?
Yeah, it's in MegaGuard. It's in other products too. MegaGuard, very effective, good prokinetic. If you're familiar with using Motil Pro or Motility Activator for CPAP patients, it's basically, if you put those two products together, that's MegaGuard. So I think it's, you know, cheaper than buying both. But everyone reacts differently. Some people may need a little magnesium citrate for motility, some a little bit of aloe, depending on the situation.
Right. So one last question: if I have a patient that, you know, I've used the Diagnostic Solutions GI map, and not a ton. I really just signed on with them in the last probably 6 to 8 months. But if you were to say, I mean, I'm getting it how the GI map is different. It's 30,000 feet up. It's looking more at what bacteria are there and what are they doing versus, you know, where are the pathogens? Let's go after them. But isn't it beneficial though to know, you know, if, for example, in the E. coli or Candida, I mean, I'm glad to see that those are in there. And I thought there was H. pylori as well. And H. pylori, I think of being more in the small intestine, but that will show up in the stool.
It will. And now, again, that's not an end all for us, for GI map, for GI, if any of the tests out there. If you do have a high H. pylori level, you may want to do a breath test to see if it's more of an issue with your upper gastrointestinal system. But yeah, we can measure it in the stool. It's not a direct correlation though to what's happening higher upstream. So we look at 17 different pathogens, but we report on the ones that are growing and are out of range. Really, that's what, because you may have even healthy individuals have small amounts of E. coli, doesn't mean that it's causing a problem or really showing up at a significant amount that we need to deal with it. So we do look at Shigella, Klebsiella, Campylobacter, different Blasto. I mean, a lot of the most common ones. It's on the sample report. I just, out of interest of slides.
Sure.
Show them all.
Now, Lacey, it's true.
But I heard Kieran's.
No, go ahead, Sally.
Go ahead. I heard Kieran speak through the Next Level Nutrition talk that he gave about a month ago. I finally got to listen to it a week and a half ago, and it was excellent. And he was describing the SIBO, you know, origin and kind of what to do about that. But in his statement about other GI tests, I understand the collection difference is key in the use of the little spiral deal to get your collection. The other thing I think is key is I'm just hearing how much research has gone into creating this, GI map technology. But wouldn't you still say that there's benefit to, a test like the diagnostic solutions? Like there's still a place for that. That these are two different kinds of tests.
Let's give them credit. They helped pave the way. Diagnostic Solutions came out with their test about maybe 5 years ago. And at the time, that was the gold standard because it was accessible. Stool testing was always very expensive. It wasn't attainable for the general public, and that's
right.
Thousands of dollars. And they help really educate people on the microbiome. They've done an awesome job, but they're using technology that's 25 years old. And 5 years ago, that was great, but now we're more advanced. And I guarantee it right here, 2 years from now, every stool company will be using whole genome sequencing like we are. So we're working with Cosmos. We didn't recreate the wheel. That would take us 15 years. They have a database of hundreds of thousands of specimens that makes their information and data more robust. So having that strength and that number of specimens to look at allows us to make these big inferences on health. Their sensitivity is 95.7%. Their specificity is over 99%. I may be off a couple percentage points on there. I can't remember, but it's the most accurate. Whereas 16S is about 50% accurate. So you can get a lot of false positives because of that. And it's not knocking them, but we're also—
you're saying the 16S is the technology that like Diagnostic Solutions uses.
Diagnostic Solutions, Genova, Vibrant, Doctor's Data. They may even use a little bit of culture, which has been debunked many years ago. And again, it's not about being like defeating to them. I don't want to badmouth anyone. I've used those tests and relied on them for years,
right.
But we've advanced, and they will too. They'll follow suit, but it'll take them some time.
Lacey, I have a question about follow-up testing.
Yeah.
At what point do you do that, and what sort of results are you seeing with it?
Yeah, it depends on the patient. Because this is a newer launch for us, I should start seeing some follow-up tests on more simple cases in around 4 or 5 months, or after 4 or 5 months after we've reviewed the report. Both of these, I've recommended a longer follow-up time. For the first one, 9 months. For the young girl, a year. I know that's a long time, but this is a marathon. I mean, if they want to do a check-in, fine, but I wouldn't expect to see any significant changes for a while. They've got a lot of work to do, and I want to be realistic about that. But ideally, you can start to make some shifts in your microbiome in about 3 or 4 months. But we have that conversation of what I'd recommend afterwards, after hearing everything. Compliance is also, a factor. Some patients have a hard time making behavior changes, but if they're ready and they're going to make these changes, then yeah, we can see some shifts pretty quickly.
I have a question on the 11-year-old girl, the case number 2.
Yeah.
Recommendation was the 12 pills. Do you have any question, or do you have any information on the follow-up with that? Like,
so this one it's going to be a while, but yeah, I'll be checking in with them pretty often. And in fact, I mean, hopefully this is a case study we can get published if we can correct it, because it's so severe. 12 capsules a day. Now, the company we work with, they're called Immunolin. They're in the pharmaceutical industry, actually, and they create a product called Interrogam that's used in ulcerative colitis and C. diff and in Crohn's. So using IgG is a pharmaceutical product, but at a lower amount. I think they recommend about 12 capsules a day to bind and get rid of C. diff. And they do have good clinical data on that. Now, using IgG, because it's a binder, it can cause more constipation. So we have that discussion, make sure water intake is good. If we need to add prokinetic, we can, certainly add it, but I'm already giving them quite a bit to deal with. So, we take it one step at a time. Some people are fine, doing the 4 capsules a day of IgG shouldn't cause any major motility problems, but everyone's different.
And then the Megaspore HU58 and the Restore Floor, do you have any updates on how that's going?
Yeah, she's actually on all 3 of those right now. And so she started that before we got, right after she did the test. So right after she submitted her specimen, she started on all 3, but now we're up, and she's doing fine on those, but we're upping the dose. So really, I'm doing 4 of each per day. You can probably go higher in an adult, but I think it's enough for her for now. And she's tolerating them fine.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I know. Everyone reacts differently, and it's impossible to say who's gonna have a die-off. Like my grandmother had a really hard time with Megaspore. I did IgG and the prebiotic instead for a few months, and now she's okay, but it's interesting because you can't predict it. We're all so unique.
Lacey, you've listed
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
You've listed omega-3 fatty acid. Are there some that are better than others?
Yeah, you want to look at quality. For a child, I don't know if they could do omega, just because when you pop the capsule, it does smell like fish oil. And there are, you can use Nordic Naturals. Designs for Health has a nice liquid that tastes like oranges. There are options, but for brain health, we look to DHA. For gut health, we look to EPA and DPA. And it does help with some microbial shifts. It does help suppress proteobacteria, which he has a major problem with. So we want to change that overall pool of fatty acid balance in her body, because that's going to influence how her body responds to inflammation and ultimately how her body turns off inflammation. And that's, we want inflammation to happen. We just don't want it to go on without ever stopping. So omega-3s and pre-resolving mediators, if you're not familiar with those, feel free to ask Tracy. They help to terminate and turn off inflammation after that process is complete. So, most people, our ancestors had almost a 1-to-1 ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. Today, we're at 20-to-1. Just our standard American diet of what we're eating. So you want to look for a clean product that's tested for lots of toxins, pesticides, dioxins, heavy metals. Most places are pretty upfront about that. But I love our omega. It's a good one.
Lacey, since we launched Phytospore and I'm talking to more veterinarians, I'm sure they're going to ask, can they use BiomeFX on animals, say dogs, or are they going to have to wait until we have a pool of samples to compare to?
Probably a pool. Good question though. I was thinking about that the other day. My dog was going through something and thought, man, I'd like to run a stool test on you or make sure you don't have COVID-19. I don't know, one or the other. But good question. No, the microbiome of a dog is actually more similar to a human's compared to mice and pigs that are used in research. But they do have some unique species, so we could ask the lab. We can definitely ask the laboratory. I'm not a veterinarian, so my knowledge of animal microbiomes is pretty minimal. But it's interesting.
Lacey, I have a question.
Yeah.
My name's Laura White. I'm a nurse practitioner in Fort Worth. We have lots of conventionally trained people around here, and so patients get passed around a lot,
Sure.
pacified, and so I get really, really difficult cases.
Yeah.
I have a 24-year-old who delivered a baby 4 weeks early, about almost a year ago now.
Okay.
She was in septic shock, hospitalized, antibiotics, the whole mess before she delivered, and that baby is not healthy.
Was there any did they swallow stool in utero or anything like that coming out?
She doesn't know.
Or the baby was in septic shock.
Mom was septic shock before she delivered,
Okay.
about